like we'll teach map and compass, and it's like clients will go like, "Are you going to teach us triangulation?" And I'll say, "No." And they'll say, "Well, why not?" And I'll say, "Well, triangulation is something that you would only have to do if you already made several mistakes."
Welcome back to the Out and Back podcast presented by Gaia GPS. I'm your host, Shanti. Today we're catching up with adventure athlete and explorer of wild places, Andrew Skurka. Skurka made his name in the outdoor world as the first person to hike the 7,700-mile sea-to-sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the first person to hike the Great Western Loop, linking together the PCT, the CDT, and other trails in a 6,800-mile trip around the American West. Now, no doubt those are incredible feats by themselves, but what really put Skurka on the map was his Alaska Yukon expedition, where he skied, hiked, and pack rafted his way through 4,700 miles of Northern Territory alone. These wilderness trips earned him the title of Adventurer of the Year by National Geographic and Outside Magazine, and Person of the Year by Backpacker Magazine. On top of all that, Skurka is an author, having written The Ultimate Gear Guide, published by National Geographic. And he also writes about all things backpacking, including gear reviews and backpacking tips, on his well-known website, andrewskurka.com. In recent years, Skurka gave up the dirtbag life of living out of his Pontiac vibe, and he changed course, so to speak, and pardon the pun. He has settled down a little bit now. He's married, he owns a home in Boulder, Colorado, he and his wife have a cat, and he owns his own business called Andrew Skurka Adventures, which focuses on guiding and teaching clients how to backpack the right way, as he says on his website. If you're lucky enough to get on one of his trips, yes, there is an application process and sometimes a waiting list, you'll get to explore beautiful and wild places with Skurka and his list of accomplished mountain guides. Places like the Brooks Range in Alaska, the High Sierra, the canyons of southern Utah, and of course the Rockies. Skurka puts in high mileage days with his clients, taking them off trail to rarely visited corners of America's most beautiful national parks. And along the way, he teaches all of his backcountry skills, including navigation using a paper map and compass. Backcountry navigation is an art form to Skurka, having used it to find his way on all three of his major expeditions. Today, Skurka is going to let us in on his method for teaching navigation in the backcountry. He also dives into some of the high routes he's developed over the years, and he lets us know about the one true and time-tested piece of gear that's been with him since he started all of this backpacking almost 20 years ago. I can't wait for this one. So here we go. Thanks for being on the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been hiking, you've been backpacking, trekking in the wilderness for what, like 20 years now?
yeah. Actually, thank you for making me feel old. It hasn't been quite 20 years, but yeah, my first big thru-hike was 2002. So I am firmly at this point an old timer.
And if I'm not mistaken, when you did start off in 2002, you kind of started off with a bang, wasn't it? Wasn't it a total thru-hike of the AT while you were still in college at Duke?
It was, yeah. So I'd done a little bit of backpacking prior to that, but not much. So like many thru-hikers who get on the trail every spring, it was essentially my first backpacking experience. Not recommended.
Well, what inspired you then to go so big right off the bat with something like the AT?
I don't think if I could have gotten out a little bit more prior, I think I would have been totally good with that. But it's just difficult being, as a college student, far from mountainous areas. So the opportunities to like get out regularly and figure out how to backpack before I took on a thru-hike were limited.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, the Appalachian Trail, that seems to inspire a lot of people. I grew up on the East Coast, so, regularly during the summer, we'd take family vacations up to Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and my friends and I during the summer, we'd especially once we got our licenses, we'd drive up to New Hampshire and go climb Mount Washington. So it was a big leap, but it wasn't a big leap in terms of the undertaking, but it wasn't unfathomable for me given that I grew up in that environment.
Right, and some of the biggest and most difficult parts of the AT were sections you had experience with as well.
Yeah, and I remember seeing thru-hikers when I was doing day hikes and stuff, and kind of wondering what that scene was all about.
Mm-hmm. hmm And then I think also what's really unique about you is that, I think when people really get into long distance hiking, it's more typical for them to do something like hike the AT and then naturally progress to the PCT and then the CDT, or maybe they start PCT and go AT, CDT. But that's normally the route I think they go. But again, you didn't really do that. You went, how shall we say, a more dramatic route. Tell us real quick about some of the routes you chose to do instead of the standard AT, PCT, CDT.
Yeah, so that's kind of your normal progression. But so after the AT, I read, and there was an article in Backpacker magazine about this, the C to C route, which at the time no one had done, and I just kind of became obsessed with the idea, and so I figured out how to kind of make it work as far as an itinerary goes, and did that after I graduated college. So it was 2004, 2005. So that was like 77,775 miles ish. It took me 11 months. I started in August, finished in July. Started up in like way up in there in Quebec, and then finished in Washington State.
Oh my gosh.
So that was 2004, 2005. And then I kind of went on this that was the first three big trips. So there's that one. There's Great Western Loop, which was 6,875 miles around the American West, and that was in 2007. And the way I talk about, and then the third one was the Alaska Yukon expedition, and that was in 2010, and that was 4,700 miles in 6 months. And there was there was a progression with all those. So through hikers, they have their progression, like AT to PCT to CDT. That totally makes sense. It's sort of this you're developing skills, and then sort of taking on something that's slightly harder. And for me, it was similar, where the Appalachian Trail was at the time the hardest thing I'd ever done, and then the C2C route, that was also the hardest thing I'd ever done. And you could say the other things about the other trips, but that C2C route was a little bit more cultural, so it was, or maybe more of a blend. It had I was on the International Appalachian Trail, the Appalachian Trail, but then when I hit the North Country Trail in upstate New York and took that all the way up to North Dakota, it was very cultural. So I was just seeing a lot more people, meeting a lot more people, staying with a lot more people, and then when I was walking across the Northern Plains, it was huge combines in North Dakota, and ranchers in Montana, and it was very cool experience as 23 years old. And then the Great Western Loop, that was I describe it as my peak, the trip where I tested all the limits as far as how fast, how far, how light I could possibly go. So it was 33 miles a day, base pack weight of 7 or 8 pounds.
Wow.
So just it was super athletic, super regimented. And then the Alaska Yukon expedition, that was a totally different beast. It was had 2,100 miles of off-trail travel. It had pack raft. It had involved skis. So it was much more of it was on the same par of magnitude with those other trips as far as distance and duration, but it was way more adventurous.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think you sort of answered my question earlier again about what drew you to doing each one of these different hikes, taking the steps from sea to sea to the Great Western Loop to Alaska, instead of doing the normal long trails like the AT, PCT, and CDT. It seemed like a natural progression for you in difficulty.
That was definitely part of it. Yeah, there was the way I describe it, to go back and do the Appalachian Trail now, it'd be going back. It would be like someone going back and repeating 4th grade, just a little too sort of basic, at least in my mind. So the appeal to me of long distance backpacking and backpacking in general has always been learning and expanding my skill set. And so when you look at the trips in that sense, they kind of make sense. And sometimes before, you don't know what a trip or what an experience like that is going to be until you kind of get into it, deeply into it. And then you're okay, this is what this experience is about.
Yeah. Yeah. Which one of those was your favorite of the three?
That's like asking, what child do you love the most? I think that at the time they've all served a really good purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you finished with Alaska, I think that was when the real accolades started coming in for you, right? Like Adventurer of the Year by Outside and National Geographic, Person of the Year by Backpacker.
No, no, they were spread out. So it was Person of the Year, Backpacker was the C2C trip. The Adventure of the Year from National Geographic, that was the Great Western Loop. And then the Adventure of the Year from Outside was the Alaska trip. So yeah, it was nicely spread out.
That's awesome. And I mean, how did it feel to get all that recognition within the community? Like, did it change anything about you or your approach to the outdoor community after getting all those accolades?
So on a personal level, no, because anyone who does these trips knows that they're not justifiable on the grounds of fame or fortune. Just not. It's just like too many hard days.
Too many variables too, I think, about just
maybe too much risk. Yeah. You just couldn't suck it up for that long dealing with those conditions if you weren't in it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
So it didn't change like my approach to trips. The one thing that it did probably change, especially after the Alaska trip, was just the level of like communal credibility and the reach.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's people take you more seriously if you've had a 16-page feature story in National Geographic magazine.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed.
Or if you've written a book about backpacking gear that has that yellow collar around the cover.
Yeah.
So I think that's how it changed things.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you still do long distance hiking, hundreds of miles or more?
That's an interesting question. So after that Alaska trip, the Alaska trip, like you have to understand, is like, I was basically like uncomfortable for 180 days. Like I don't want to like, I've never served in the military, but I don't think it's like a huge stretch to say that like it's like similar conditions to being in war, where there's just like constant uncertainty, where you wake up in the morning, you're not actually convinced you're going to like have dinner that night. And that got old. It really like wore on me. And like my mom, multiple times when I would call her from various locations, would say something like, you're going to have like PTSD when you get done with this, because it was just super stressful.
Yeah.
So after the Alaska trip, my appetite for adventure had been sort of quenched for a while. And I also, before I left for that Alaska trip, I was at this place in my life where I was in my late 20s. I felt like I was like hustling a lot and like, but still living on crumbs. I was like, I could put all of my belongings in plastic totes and put them into my Pontiac Vibe. And I rented month to month. And that annual letter you get from the Social Security Administration telling you like what your earnings have been.
Oh, mark it on the calendar every year.
Yeah, it was like laughable to see like what my earnings were every year. And I think that just that lifestyle for me sort of had reached an expiration date. It's sort of like for how many years can you be a ski bum?
Yeah.
Right. Similar thing. So after I kind of had told myself that like after this Alaska trip, see what comes of it. And if it's just like not working still, like if you still feel like you're hustling and like, bashing your head against a wall to make it work, then just get a normal job and just, you get into like adventure part-time. Mm-hmm. And thankfully that's not what happened.
Yeah. Awesome. So then I see you've been doing for the last several years guided expeditions and backcountry trips. Love to talk a little bit about that. So what are some guided trips you've been doing over the past few years?
Yeah, so I started guiding trips in 2011. At the time, it was like I just sort of threw it out there, have no idea if people would even sign up. It's like, well, like, you want to come hike with me? And I think at the time, like I expected the program to be, I think I expected the program to be where like an opportunity for them to get a piece of what the trips were like from me. So like we would go on like really hard, adventurous, bold trips. And I realized like the very first season, so I ran 3 trips that summer, that wasn't going to work, because the base skill level for most prospective clients was way lower than it needed to be.
Mhm.
So I like retooled the program, and it became like this sort of very learning intensive operation. We don't call ourselves a school, but we have a very strong educational focus. And we run 3, 5, 7-day trips. And like the 3-day trip is like I call it backpacking fundamentals course. And it's really designed just to like help beginner backpackers, even first time backpackers, like figure out how to backpack. And it's pretty basic stuff. What gear they need, what food they need. And then we get out there and we show them how to like set up shelters and purify water and how to navigate and how to pack their backpack. So it's all pretty basic. And then the more advanced trips, the 5 and 7-day trips, we're taking on a little bit more advanced skills, like off-trail navigation. And then like on the high end, we offer trips up in the Brooks Range. So now you're dealing with grizzly bears, big rivers, really difficult terrain.
Natural difficulty leveling up. So
Yeah.
it's great you mentioned navigation instructions, a key part of what you offer. I think it's safe to say you're one of the experts, the absolute experts in the industry on navigation. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who want to do more to improve their navigation skills so that they can do better and feel safer in the backcountry and also not be restricted to the trail system. So I guess my first question on navigation, because I want to talk about that a lot, is what's your personal view, your personal philosophy on the importance of navigation and why people should always be trying to improve their navigational skills in the backcountry?
Yeah, I say it. So the way I describe navigation, it's one of the most important backcountry skills, and so I say one of the most important. But it's definitely like the most liberating. So like I think in terms of importance, I would put it on par with like knowing what gear to pack, or knowing how to prepare your food, or leave no trace, or some of those other like core skills. But there's no other skill out there that allows you to like really drive your own trip. Instead of being limited to very well maintained trails and having to stay close to a trailhead and relying on very accurate signage, you can really start to wander.
It's like freedom in the backcountry is what it seems
yeah,
like.
If you can take it to that level. So there are grades of navigational competence, right? On one hand, like a beginner is just going to be happy to like go out onto a trail system and be able to get to a trail junction and orient that map and determine which way they need to go. On the more advanced level, you're going to a place like the Brooks Range and where there are no trails, and you're navigating entirely off trail, and you're trying to find the path of least resistance through really complex terrain with tussocks and willow and big river fords, and you have the opportunity to follow like moose trails and caribou trails, and so there's this really high end level of navigation as well.
Yeah. So like when we're talking about a navigation course, introducing somebody to navigation or building their skills, what would you say are the common navigational mistakes people make?
Number one mistake they make is not paying attention. That is like the big mistake that they make. So let's see. I'm just trying to think about how so the way I teach navigation is I ask clients to tell me a story about where they've been and where they're going. I'm sorry, where they've been, where they are, and where they're going. And when they tell me this story, I ask them to support the story with them using their navigational instruments. And so, for example, a client will say, all right, well, listen, we started here this morning. This is where we camped last night. And they'll show me on the map where we camped. And they'll say, now we're at a trail junction. And we reached this trail junction after walking for an hour. And then they look at the map and they're like, okay, and I think we're at this trail junction because this junction is about 2.5 miles from where we camped, and we walk at about 2.5 miles an hour.
Right.
So in that case, they're using their map reading skills, they're using dead reckoning, they could like continue to build out the story. They could say, well, I checked on multiple occasions. I checked the bearing of the trail, and we were always walking east. And this junction is east of where we camped last night. They could continue adding. They could say, and I look at my altimeter, and my altimeter reads that we're at 10,100 feet. And if I look at the map, we're at the 10,100 foot contour line, which probably doesn't have a 10,100 foot contour line, but you get what I'm saying. Right. And then they could like really confirm it. They could fire up Gaia GPS and say, Gaia, where am I? And Gaia would tell them exactly that they're at that trail junction.
Right.
So that's sort of telling, that's where they were and that's where they are. And then I'd say, all right, so where are we going? And then they need to like tell me this story about, again, using their tools, saying, all right, well, we're going to hike up to this pass. And the pass is at 12,000 feet. So when we get to the pass, my altimeter should read 12,000 feet. We're going to be walking, the trail takes a south turn. So if I take a compass bearing, we should be walking more south. You get the idea. I think that storytelling is like, it's the most powerful device that I've found to teach navigation, and clients really take to it. That makes sense to them. It sort of forces them to like be attentive, and be anticipating of what's ahead, and it forces them to use all their tools. So it seems to work really well.
Awesome. So let's talk about some of these tools specifically that people are going to be using on the trail. So what navigational equipment do you take with you? And maybe we'll come back to two parts of this, what tools you're going to be using for off trail and which ones you should always have for both off trail and going on something like the AT. So what equipment do you take with you specifically for going off trail?
So I'm like an all of the above person. But the importance of those tools will vary depending on where you are. So in a place like, let's actually just like, I'll take it simply. So like if you're on the Appalachian Trail, the most important tool that you have is a watch, because you'll dead reckon all the time. You'll use that data book that you can get. So it'll say like, the McAfee Knob shelter at mile 4.1, and then there's a spring at mile 4.8. So you've got 7/10 of a mile to go to that spring. And if you walk at 3 miles an hour, you're going to be in 15 minutes. So you're constantly using your watch. And then when you get to, you don't even need like a compass for the Appalachian Trail, because anytime you get to a road, it's either east or west, left or right. So you don't even need a compass for the Appalachian Trail. An altimeter is really nice for the Appalachian Trail because you can rule out all of the fault summits, which are many along the Appalachian Trail.
I'm thinking of Mount Lafayette. Oh gosh, that was my least
how
favorite.
Many times are you like, oh, we're almost there, No, you're not. So, you have another just another 200-foot roller, another 500-foot roller before you finally get up there. And then if you're off trail, I mean, again, that's going to vary a little bit. So if I'm in the High Sierra, the most important thing that I'm going to be carrying with me is my topographic map, because the features in the High Sierra, and like in most parts of the Mountain West, you have more visibility. Because you're either like in alpine or it's or like open woodland, and then the topography is so distinct. Like you just a 1,500-foot vertical face just jumps out at you on the map.
Right.
Whereas if you're in West Virginia, those rolling hills, all those knobs, those are much more difficult to pick up on a map. So again, topographic map, super helpful in a place like the High Sierra. In a place like Alaska, topographic maps are helpful, but I'd actually say like the more important thing there, it's not actually a tool, but it's pattern recognition. So this ability to like look out at a landscape, and based on what you've seen before, you can correctly identify like where you're going to encounter thick brush, where you're going to encounter like standing water, where you're going to encounter like the safest, or where you might find like the safest place to cross a creek. So, and that's just sort of reading the landscape.
Okay, so what's an example of like that pattern recognition where you were able to do that over like 100 or 200 mile stretch in the Brooks Range or on your Alaska Yukon expedition?
Yeah. Okay. So if you're in the Brooks Range and you're there and say like you're there like say in June, and you look out at this like field of like this kind of flat expanse of like open terrain with no trees. Maybe you can see like some texture, like some shrubby stuff on top, and you see these little like cotton ball, like they look like little like plants with cotton ball tips.
Mm-hmm.
Stay the hell away from those things, because that is a sea of tussocks, and tussocks are like it's a unique like Arctic plant, but it's basically like walking on like unstable 6-gallon like utility buckets, something like that. Or like imagine like walking on a carpet with a bunch of basketballs underneath it. Something like that.
Just incredibly unstable. Yeah. And
It's just the wear and tear on your lower extremities is really intense. So if you can identify a tussock field just based on what you've seen in the past, you can do your best to avoid them.
Awesome. So coming back to this maps question on topographic maps, so it sounds like you're more in. Are you more in favor of paper maps, or do you prefer going more like digital maps, or are there different situations where each one's better? I guess start with the first one. Which one?
This is interesting. This is a really interesting question. So Alan Dix and I were actually just talking about this the other day. So if you have studied the map, the paper map, if you've studied the paper map really well, and if you just sort of understand like the general topography, like where the major drainages are, where the major ridges are, you're already like sort of familiar with your route. I think you can use a digital map and be fine. Like you could just be on like Gaia all day long. But my experience is that the limited screen size of a smartphone makes it really difficult for clients to understand that macro topography. And if you don't understand the macro topography, it becomes difficult then to follow the micro topography, because you're really not sure where you are and where you're going in the grand scheme of things. So we actually had this experiment last year where last minute I scored a permit in Yosemite to take a group south of Tioga Road, and our route originally was going to be north of the road. So I had printed out topographic maps for the group, and they were of a route that we didn't end up taking. But they had all downloaded the maps beforehand on their phones, so we at least had they all had digital maps. And clients just didn't grasp navigation on that trip like they did on others, because there's just something missing. They were just looking at the screen size. They're just too small. They just weren't really understanding where they were. So I think that personally, I still love paper maps to navigate with, and my phone is a backup. That's kind of my style. And I think that for the sake of learning how to navigate, I think that most people will do better with that approach.
Yeah.
There obviously is like a huge efficiency in having just a digital map. If you're just like following a trail, or if you if you already know the topography, you can just pull it out and quickly just double check. But yeah, that's kind of where I fall right now.
Yeah. So then going with paper maps, you probably have to be working on things like bearings and declination. So like for someone who's going out on a wilderness trek using a paper map, like what would be like a key skill that they need to know? What should they at least know about things like declination and bearings before they're heading out into the backcountry?
So there's a lot of things. So there's actually, if anyone really is interested, so I did this great navigational series, like basically a how to navigate series on it's up on my website. It's like a 4-part series, and in the very last post is basically like a skills checklist. There's a whole skills checklist, and if you want to specifically talk about maps, so you should be able to look at a map, and you should be able to measure distances. You should be able to measure topographic change, so like in like vertical feet or vertical meters. You should be able to look at the map and determine or like make some at least determine like where there's going to be vegetation that's taller than your head and where there isn't going to be. And sort of the pro skill is looking at the map and speculating even more in depth. So like if you look at an area on the map that's shaded in green, you should be able to like look at the map and say, well, I'm going to find lodgepole pine here, and I find ponderosa pine here, and I find aspen here, and I find spruce fir here. And if you're looking at a map or an area on the map that's white, you should be able to say, I'm going to find alpine tundra, I'm going to find talus, I'm going to find scree, I'm going to find a meadow, I'm going to find an avalanche slope. So that would be like the shading part. You should definitely also understand the difference between magnetic north and true north, so you can properly orient that map.
Okay.
That's another like really important thing.
Do paper maps have listings of declinations on them? Or is it like only specific ones like US Topo or Nat Geo?
It would depend on any decent map is going to have a declination adjustment on it.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm not sure like a AAA car map would, but any like if you print out a map from like Caltopo, or if you were to like somehow find an original like USGS printed map, it's gonna have a declination chart on it.
So you have your maps, you have your compass. Are there any specific compasses that you recommend? A specific watch that you recommend? So
I like, as far as the compass goes, I like there's a great Suunto compass, the M3DG, and it's got a global needle on it. And the global needle, it's designed so that you can go northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere and have it be equally functional. The nicer thing about that global needle, though, is that your compass doesn't need to be perfectly level for it to operate properly. Like it's you've got a little bit of you can tilt it a little bit and it still works well. So that's the compass I like, and it's not inexpensive. And I've actually heard that it's been discontinued, maybe like not in stock right now. So that's the compass I like. But it depends on how much compass use you're doing. I mean, if you just need to get to a trail junction and just find north, a very simple like base plate compass that costs $15 is fine. Mm-hmm. You don't need it to be adjustable. You don't need it to have a global needle. It definitely doesn't need a sighting mirror. So that's kind of compasses. As far as the watches go, if you're just doing dead reckoning, you could buy a $10 or $15 watch that just tells time. I think digital is easier to work with. So basic digital watch. If you are going to be in like a place with some vertical relief and you want, it's really nice to have an altimeter. So you could buy the altimeter watches are pretty inexpensive now. I think you could probably find one for like $150. The best watch though, it's the GPS watches. Mm-hmm. So like my favorite for backpacking is still the Suunto Ambit 3-peak. You could also do like the Suunto 9. Some of the issues with these like fancy watches nowadays is that the battery life is actually worse than it used to be, because now they have like touch screens. It's like a color touch screen. So it just not as battery efficient as the old like dot matrix style. Mm-hmm. And if you have a GPS watch, I mean that simplifies a lot, because now you don't even have to dead reckon, because you just hit your lap button at a trail junction and the watch will tell you how long you've walked since the last time you hit your lap button. It'll also record your vertical gain and loss for the day. Mm-hmm. So like if you're doing like any of these high routes, which I think we'll probably get into later. So any route, and not even just a high route, any trail or route that is extremely vertical, what you'll find is that the limitation is actually not your horizontal distance each day. It's how many vertical feet you can sustainably climb each day. So we have found in guiding trips in locations like, say, Rocky Mountain or the High Sierra, it's extremely predictable how many vertical feet per day a group is going to go based on their fitness. So like a strong group. So like Andrew, how old are you?
33. I think.
And
Yeah,
what's
33.
your fitness relative to your peers?
Definitely above average.
Okay.
Declining by the day since since I finished my through-hike 3 months and counting.
Okay. And then and what's your height and weight?
6 foot exactly, 180, I'd say.
Okay. So I would put you in one of our high intensity groups, and those groups are like within by the end of the trip, on average, they'll be within like 100 feet plus minus of about 3,250 vertical feet of climbing per day.
Awesome.
It's
That sounds doable.
remarkably consistent.
Awesome.
And obviously, what goes up must come down too. But so anyway, so if you have an altimeter or a GPS watch, it'll record that. So you'll start to like, I can be looking at the watch and go like, all right, well, this group has about 1,000 vertical feet left for the day, and wherever we're going to climb 1,000 vertical feet, and they're going to want to camp.
Yeah.
So figure that out. Yeah.
Cool. Oh, cool stuff. Good stuff about navigation. I wanted to say before we I'd love to talk a little bit more about the high routes, but before we do that, kind of want to wrap up the navigation thing, a story. Can you give us an example of a time where using your navigation skills really helped you get out of a tough situation?
The idea with the navigational story is that you don't end up in a tough situation.
That's the right answer.
Yeah. So it's never like if you're having to. So clients will we'll teach map and compass, and it's like clients will go like, "Are you going to teach us triangulation?" And I'll say no, and they'll say, "Well, why not?" And I'll say, "Well, triangulation is something that you would only have to do if you already made several mistakes. Like triangulation is finding yourself, and why are you ever having to find yourself? You should always just sort of be found. And if you're constantly telling yourself this navigational story, you just kind of always know where you are, you know where you're going, you know what you should be expecting. And the one thing I didn't mention about this navigational story earlier is that when your story is no longer consistent with what your navigational tools are telling you, that's where you need to stop and figure out what's going on. So, for example, like that story that we told earlier, suppose that from that trail junction you started hiking towards that pass, and you're like, okay, yep, we're walking south, and you get to what you think is the pass, and your altimeter watch reads 11,500 feet, and you're like, well, like the pass though is at 12,000 feet. And like your altimeter watch is never going to be off by 500 vertical feet. So that's at that point you would stop, you take out your map, maybe you fire up Gaia GPS, and like you figure out what's going on. Why are your tools telling you it's inconsistent with your story?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in this case it was a fault summit. Maybe in this case there was you took a wrong turn. Was a use trail to another pass. Who knows what was going on? But the point is that your story is not adding up. So stop and figure it out.
Right. It's a good way of looking at it. Yeah. And it's like a constant self-check to make sure where you are. And then that way, yeah, like you said, it prevents you from being in a situation where you're now out of position because you've been doing a constant self-check-in.
Right.
So awesome. Cool. So yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the high routes now. So with us talking about the high routes, there might be some of us who are still a little unfamiliar with what exactly they are and how to get at them. So can you quickly describe what the high routes are and what you and why you and a growing number of people are really being drawn to them?
Yeah. So high route is, let's see how to describe this. They tend to be say 50 to 200 miles, and they follow the best terrain, and when the terrain stops being awesome, the route also stops.
Right.
So typically they're going to follow a watershed. I think a watershed divide would probably be the most standard thing to follow, and that could, in some cases, like the Wind River High Route or the Fifner Traverse, it coincides with the Continental Divide.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, like say the Kings Canyon High Basin route, it follows it's basically the upper watershed of the Kings River. It's like the South Fork and Middle Fork of the Kings. Um, uh, in the Yosemite High Route, it circumnavigates the upper watershed of the park, or it circumnavigates basically the park boundary, which coincides with the watersheds of the Tuolumne and Merced rivers. So high routes are they're not intentionally off trail, but they end up being having a lot of off trail travel just because where the route should go, there's no trail.
Right.
But they also shouldn't be contrived. So you're not like, you don't want them to be like stupidly hard, and you don't want them like, you shouldn't be like seeking out the hardest terrain. It should be the most sort of like natural, most scenic, sort of like best bang for the buck.
Right. So like following the tops of the Sierra, but following it in a way that logistically makes sense for you at the same time.
Yeah, right. Because you also don't want to like go get too technical. So like the limitation, like the technical limit on most high routes is going to be like it's going to be like class 3, which would be like most people describe that as scrambling. So hands and feet, probably not significant consequences in the event of a fall.
Okay. What would you say like the level of experience? You kind of answered that by saying class 3, but what would you say like the level of experience, or like what does it take for someone to do a high route in terms of off trail navigation and general physical ability and backcountry survival?
Yeah, so there are kind of two pieces to it. There's a fitness element, and then there's a skill element. The fitness is, you've got to be pretty fit to take one of these things on, because the amount of vertical gain and loss is just absurd. Like so for context, I think on like the John Muir Trail, it gains and loses about 350 vertical feet per mile.
Okay.
Or it gains or loses. So 350 vertical feet of change per mile. The Kings Canyon High Basin route is like 750. So more than twice as much up and down per mile as on the John Muir Trail. And a lot of people like think the John Muir Trail is like, that's like the hardest section on the Pacific Crest Trail. So the Kings Canyon High Basin route is just sort of on like another level physically.
Would you say that's the hardest high route out there?
It's actually not. I think the Fifner is I think like 800 vertical feet up and down per mile, or up or down per mile. And it's also like all above, it's between 10 and 13,000 feet. The Wind River High Route probably has the most amount of like talus and like alpine travel. So that route is also pretty difficult. So there's this physical piece of your preparedness that you just need to be ready just to throw it down. And it's back to our earlier conversation, you can't think about it in terms of miles. It's all about vertical. So like I've guided some groups where it took us all all day. We covered, I think there was one day we covered 4 miles, but we did 3,000 vertical feet of gain. And for this group, that was what they had. That was it. So, that's, I think, if I told them at the beginning of the day that they were only going to hike 4 miles that day, they'd be like, oh man, this is going to be easy. And by the end of the day, they were all wiped. So there's the physical piece. And then there's obviously the skill piece. You're talking about quite a bit of off-trail travel. And it's also off-trail travel through like fairly remote areas, just because by virtue of it being off-trail, not too many people get back in there. And the amount of off-trail travel varies. Like the Wind River High Route is tops on the list. I think it's 2/3 off-trail.
Okay.
Which is that's a lot of off-trail travel. It's a 97-mile route. So it's like 66, 67 miles of off-trail travel. And then like the Fifner Traverse, I think, is the lowest, and that's like 40% off trail.
Cool. So, and these are all newer ones too. Like these markings have been like, they're no more than 20 years old.
Oh, not even. Yeah. So the original high route was the Sierra High Route, and that was Steve Roper. And he put together his guidebook. I think he first released his guidebook in like the early 80s. So like basically when I was born. And then there's an update to that guidebook. It's a Mountaineers Press guidebook. I've got it on my bookshelf. I could look up at the copyright. I think that guidebook, it was updated like in the late 90s. And so Roper sort of like sort of define what a high route should be. But it didn't really catch on until maybe 10 years ago. And I definitely have been like pushing these things because I think for me, they work for me on so many levels. High routes, they're like physically very intense. And I love that. I'm an ultra runner and like a long distance, like I'm training for a marathon right now. So that physical challenge just really appeals to me. They also appeal to me because you can do them in a relatively short period of time. My life doesn't really allow me to take off for 6 months at a time anymore. I'm married. I own a home. I've run a small business. I have that fur child that came in earlier. He'd be devastated if I left for 6 months. Devastated. But I can get away for a week or two, and you can do at least like a pretty heady section of these routes, if not the whole thing, within 1 to 2 weeks. And then the other nice thing too is that the route is like all awesome all the time. There aren't these sections. Like if you do like a thru-hike, there are like weeks and hundreds of miles that are like either like or maybe like better. They're okay. But
yeah.
And if you just what trail did you just do?
I just did the AT, and I'm just thinking about all the times I was in the Green Tunnel.
All of those marginal miles where you're just like, if you have 2 weeks of vacation, you don't want to spend your 2 weeks in that terrain. You want to spend it in world class, premier stuff, right?
Yeah, and Adventure Allen was talking about that when we were talking with him. He said that it's almost frustrating when you're on the John Muir Trail and you have these incredible peaks to your east, and it's like frustrating. I want to go up that way, Yeah. But with the Sierra High Route, you are going up over that section.
Exactly. Yeah, and the similar experience too with like the Continental Divide Trail through the Front Range in Colorado or through the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It just completely bypasses all of this amazing terrain.
Yeah,
the Fifner Traverse is could be like the most scenic 100 miles in the entire Continental Divide Trail, along with the Wind River High Route. So again, those two high routes, you got 175 miles of probably like the most scenic terrain in the entire trail, and the entire terrain, the most scenic terrain that's sort of within striking distance of the trail, and the trail just sort of bypasses a ton of it.
Yeah. So with these high routes, with more and more of them being out there, gaining more and more popularity, do you see new ones coming up on the horizon? Like, are there other high routes out there that are still left to get that really haven't been hit yet?
Yeah, there are definitely a few. I'm hoping that some other people sort of take up the slack. I've been sort of preoccupied and haven't been able to come out with a guidebook every year. I do see some of that happening where people are putting together things. There's still some out there, but you are limited by terrain too. There are only so many places in the country where there's enough terrain to warrant an effort. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking here in Colorado, I've looked at other other opportunities to put something together, and it's tougher. There aren't too many. There maybe something down in the San Juans. I think there's one other route down the San Juans, but otherwise, I look at those maps and I'm you're kind of forcing it. You'd have to cross 3 Jeep roads in 50 miles, or there's basically a trail the entire way, or you're really fighting to try to hold your elevation, something like that. It just doesn't, the train doesn't sort of as naturally flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think there are limited opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, then what's next for Andrew Skurka? What high routes are you going to be guiding on this year?
So long as the coronavirus doesn't cancel all of our trips, we've got a pretty busy guiding schedule. We start next month down in southern Utah, and then we move to West Virginia. We go up to the Brooks Range in June. We go Yosemite high route basically Yosemite in July and September, and then I just put in for a San Juan's permit for August.
Awesome.
So it's a pretty busy year.
Cool. And how do people keep up with you on these trips? And also, how would people sign up for these trips in the future?
So if anyone's interested, my recommendation is to sign up as soon as registration opens, which usually is like in the middle of December. We have there's an open registration period where it's not on a first come first served basis. It's just sort of like an open window for a couple of weeks. And like this year, all of our trips were sold out basically by the third week of January, which is wild. So just get on it early. That would be my recommendation. And then I'm pretty easy to find. If your readers could just search my last name, Skurka, and I'll come up. Yeah.
Cool deal. Cool stuff, man. Well, thanks so much for all this. I wanted to do a nice wrap up for us. Want to do 3 rapid fire questions for you. So first question, what's your all-time favorite piece of gear?
The one piece of gear that has been in my kit for probably the longest is it's a 900 milliliter Evernew titanium pot. I bought my first one in 2004, and I think I'm on number 2 or 3.
Awesome.
Which is remarkable. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Question 2. One thing you wish you knew before you started backpacking.
Well, I backpacked in a different era. I started learning to backpack in a different era. But if I could do it over again, I would adopt the attitude that you buy once and cry once.
Buy once and cry once.
Yeah,
like it.
And that applies. I mean, everything else that I get into, I try to kind of do that. Like if I buy a kitchen knife, just buy the one you want, and that's it's gonna last you 20 years.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. And number 3, would you rather? If you had a choice when backpacking, would you want to never have to eat and drink or never have to sleep?
Oh, I definitely would rather not have to sleep.
Me too. Because eating and drinking's lovely. It's the best part about it.
Yeah. And then you could just go.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. You gave us so much great info. Obviously, we wish you the best in everything you do. Good luck on your guided trips. We'll give a good plug to you in our show notes. And thanks again so much for taking some time to talk with us today.
Good deal. Loved it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, Andrew. Bye-bye. Adventurer, guide, and author Andrew Skurka, everybody. Our thanks to him for joining us on the show. You can find him at his website, andrewskurka.com, or you can follow him on Instagram at Andrew Skurka. Check out our show notes if you want a link to his book, Gear Guide, published by National Geographic. Hey, and before you go, check out what's going to be coming up on our next show. In the next episode, we're switching gears and we're going to be talking with Kevin and Sarah McHouston, the hosts of the YouTube channel Lifestyle Overland. The McHoustons gave up life in the suburbs and traded it for a full-time residence on the back roads of America. And so they're going to tell us about their transition to becoming full-time travelers and what it's like living on these back roads with their young daughter, Caroline. Also, it's not too late to go back and listen to our last episodes in the meantime with long-distance hikers Heather Anderson and the Real Hiking Viking. And finally, if you like the show, please make sure to leave us a review and share it with your friends. We would really appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Shanty, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Out and Back podcast presented by Gaia GPS. Have a good one.